Hi, y'all. I can say that with two Southerners in front of me. So, welcome to the Frank and Lizzie show. I was in New Orleans last month and I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Carpenter while I was there and ironically hear about his data during a cellular tissue product. So, Frank, hello.
Hello, I'm happy to be here. And actually, I know Dr. Shaun Carpenter because I used to work in Louisiana and I always thought the world of him because he was always innovative. And actually, you even have an English major. And so he brought in a lot of innovation to what we do.
All right. So, Dr. Carpenter has published the latest and greatest in terms of cellular tissue products, though I'm sure he'll never say that. So he had the ability to take a look at the data from his centers. We're going to talk to him about his most recent publication. So Dr. Carpenter, welcome and thank you for talking to us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah. And why don't you tell us what setting you work in, because that's going to kind of highlight what the article was.
That's a great question. So I work in all the settings. So for whatever reason, my career path has taken me to the short-term acute hospital, to the long-term acute hospital, or LTACs, to nursing homes, SNFs, into the home, into HOPD, wound centers, where I'm still a medical director of the largest HOPD in Louisiana at Baton Rouge, as well as I run 30 private office wound centers. And then in 2010, my partner Todd and I created TeleWound. We have the trademark, so if you're using it, my lawyer will be contacting you. So we created TeleWound in 2010 with 3G Verizon wireless cards and laptops.
Way before COVID. Way before all this.
Yeah. And so we trademarked it, and then COVID hit, and everybody started to use the word TeleWound. And it was kind of cool to know that we created this a long time ago. The thing I don't understand is that the clarity of the picture and the image and the videos was way better with the 3G Verizon wireless cards, and here we are with 5G, and it was supposed to be 100 times faster, but somehow TeleWound 10 years ago was better than the choppy reception you get now. But to answer your question, I've been in and I am in all of the sites of service. So it's a very odd perspective because I feel like in this specialty, a lot of people are in HOPD, or they're in nursing homes, or they just go into the home, or they just go into LTACs, or they just round in the short-term acute, or they have their own private offices and so forth. So it's a very strange perspective to not only practice in them all, run a business in them all, and then understand, wait, where am I? Okay, insurance covers what in this setting? Which wound type? The reimbursement is different here than it is here. The site of service code is different than it is here, and so it can be very schizophrenic. But at the end of it all, I feel like oddly experienced in this very new and exciting specialty.
And that's all exciting, but I have to tell you one thing about Shaun Carpenter. A company hired me to see if he knew what he was talking about. And I remember, this is just news, I remember going into his clinic and what I saw was spectacular. So everything that he just said is what I witnessed. So anyway, kudos to you.
Well,
I did it with a team. Nobody ever does anything alone. So I think my greatest strength is collaboration. And when I understood, when my partner, Todd Shavit, who's a nurse practitioner, when I understood the power of what a nurse practitioner, what they brought to the specialty. We have 70 physicians and nurse practitioners, and our nurse practitioners are every bit as good as our physicians. And we train them to be that way. And it's not, the physicians aren't insulted or somehow diminished because the nurse practitioners are every bit as good. It's a good thing. Like when we train, I tell them all the time, I'm training you to be better than me. That's the whole point. If I'm training a copy of a copy of a copy, then the quality is just going to get less and less and less, especially as you expand into more states. So, I think leading up into the research, I felt like I owed it to the specialty that really changed my life to kind of put this data out there, non-vendor sponsored, just here's the data, 6-year Medicare retrospective, self-funded. We didn't take any vendor dollars, and we had offers. And I said, no, I just want to show in the real world what happens when you use skin substitutes. And I think we used 8 or 9 different types. I mean, there's all types. There's bovine, there's porcine, there's human amniotic, there's dehydrated amniotic, there's cryopreserved or hypothermically preserved amniotic. So just kind of throw them all in there, and let's really look at how many applications does it really take in the real world. Not, hey, I've really got this RCT where we want to make these. I mean, I got to tell you, I have not read a single vendor-sponsored RCT that said that the product didn't work.
Right.
I haven't read one. And not to say that RCTs are important, they are, and this is how the industry works. But let's also look at the real-world retrospective data that it's really hard to bias when you're looking at all these different graphs. You say, well, how did they do in different wound types? And how many grafts does it really take? And you have an LCD that first came out and said, well, 2 grafts is enough. I'm like, I don't know what planet you're living on, but no, not in the real world. And then they said, oh, okay, well, we're gonna make it 4. And so when the LCDs came out, I said, well, we have the data. We have 30 locations, and we also go into nursing homes and in the home, and that's the data you usually don't get. Because
Sure.
RCTs, you can't have a site, a research site as the home.
Well, and it's certainly such a growing area for those applications. You find more care going into the home or going to where the resident or patient is rather than the patient coming to you, particularly in patients. We know wound care patients have mobility issues, or thinking about a pressure injury patient like coming to clinic. But this focus of the research was both diabetic foot ulcers, which is often the topic in these RCTs, but also venous leg ulcers. Which is super important, I think, to point out in this that it's real world for both those ulcer types. So did you find like a huge difference between the healing capacity between the diabetic foot ulcer population that was getting CTPs and the VLUs that were getting CTPs?
There was a slight difference, but for the most part, it was pretty consistent. And so when you look at the number of applications that it would take to heal, of the patients that healed, I think that's the important point here, is we looked at, of the patients that healed with skin substitutes, it took around 6 applications. And then there was a standard deviation there. That standard deviation was different on the DFUs and on the VLUs, but overall the data was fairly similar for the DFUs and VLUs. It wasn't different enough to where I would think that you would say, well, look, you need a separate LCD for DFUs and a separate LCD for VLUs. They lumped them together. It's not perfect, but I think it'll, from the data that we gathered anyway, it just suggests that you can do an LCD that includes them both. Now, we're not even talking about surgical wounds. We're not talking about trauma wounds. We're not talking about pressure ulcers and all these other wounds.
Sure.
Which, by the way, that's the part 2 of the research.
Is it coming? Is this like first heard it here?
There's Star Wars, and then there's Empire Strikes Back, and that's the Godfather 1, Godfather 2, whatever sequel you prefer. But the whole idea is to put the data out there, knowing that my competitors are going to look at this data and say, oh, well, look at those healing rates. They're out there advertising we heal 99% of wounds, Here's the reality. With skin substitutes, DFUs and VLUs combined, on patients that had stalled and basically had gone through that 4-week period and we did all the standard of care and then some. We even did ultrasonic debridement aggressively. So, compression wraps, total contact casts. I'm talking about true total contact casts, the ones you actually have to wrap.
Oh, they're fun.
The ones that actually pressure offload plantar surface of the foot. We spared no expense to make sure that we were practicing what we thought was the best wound medicine we could. So we had this cohort of patients that would fail standard of care, and then we would put them into what we have is basically ground rounds every Thursday the whole company calls in and says, okay, I have this patient. Does it qualify? You got to get the vascular studies on this one. This one might have osteomyelitis. You need to look at that. So they have to go through this filter and then meet all the LCD criteria. And then when the LCD came out, this big national LCD proposal, I said, we actually have the data to say, let's take that exact LCD and let's lay it on top of what it would look like if we had been using that LCD for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a very unique opportunity. So we basically looked at that data, and what we found was 47.4% of all the patients healed with skin substitutes after they had failed. And I looked and I said, man, I mean, I like to think of myself as the best there is. I mean, we're the best wound healers in the nation. That's how we look at ourselves, right? And I don't know if I trust going into any specialist who doesn't think that about themselves, obviously with the humility to learn more all the time, but we thought we were really good. And I was like, man, 47%, how am I gonna publish this when competitors are gonna say, well, we heal 95%. Why don't you go to them? We heal 95%. I said, well, you know what? I know that we're doing everything that we can do to heal wounds, but let's get the data out there and show realistically, hey, if you're using skin substitutes appropriately and you're following standard of care and going above and beyond to control all the impediments to wound healing, skin substitutes can heal about half of those patients that were stalled.
And was that with 4 applications?
That
or
was
6
that was
applications,
all the
or-
way. That was the
Up to
range
10.
all the way. We never went beyond 10 because that was the LCD, but that was the range from whether they got 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10. But if you look at
Okay.
the entire population, that was the healing rate. And I think, well, if we're talking about cancer and somebody says, hey, I'm going to give you a pill and half the patients are going to be cured, you'd be like, this is a miracle drug,
Yeah,
right? I mean, that would be the most talked about drug in the history of the world, right? And so what I learned in this process was skin substitutes work. They all work to varying degrees. And this whole idea that it takes 3 or 4 applications on real world complex wounds is ridiculous, especially when you look at the sizes of wounds that you're starting with. If you're talking about a 1 square centimeter wound, well, yeah, you could probably get away with 2 or 3 applications on a lot of these wounds. But as your wounds get bigger, you need more applications.
As I would say, I think size matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, I wrote an article about that. I mean, for wounds. I wrote the article for wounds.
Yeah, for sure.
But your data, you said you were the 40% healing rate?
47 with the skin substitutes. I'm not talking about the non-skin substitute patients. Using
the
skin
non-healers.
substitutes, the patients, all comers, when we use skin substitutes, we healed 47.4% of those patients after they had proven that they had stalled. I'm not talking about, hey, I got a wound that's probably going to heal on its own and I'm putting a skin substitute on it. And that's the key. And then the other piece of data that's really interesting is that the overall wound area reduction rate was 80%. So we talk about, okay, well, you healed 47.4% of these wounds with the skin substitutes that were stalled before. But somehow we're not going to really think about that skin substitutes aren't necessarily there to heal every wound. If you can take a wound that's 100 square centimeters and bring it down to 20 square centimeters, to me, that is a tremendous win. And some of these wounds, you use skin substitutes to bridge them to a flap, a skin substitute, split the skin graft. It's not, if the skin substitute isn't, curing cancer and healing wounds and creating peace in the Middle East, then they don't work, right? There's a spectrum. And so what we found was that our skin substitute use reduced wound area by 80%, which
It's huge.
is huge. So there's 2 things. Yes, we want to get the wounds healed. Skin substitutes are not the only answer out there. It's not a magic bullet. It'll probably get half of your wounds healed that were stalled. You need a plan for the other half. You can't use skin substitutes forever because we found the plateau was right around 7.
Okay.
Once you got to 7 applications, if the wound wasn't healed by then, you keep going 8, 9, 10. It didn't really have this huge increment. It was kind of diminishing returns. So if you're trying to save the system money, and this is what we recommended to CMS and to the MACs, 7 is kind of a good number, right?
Okay.
That's what a lot of the other data showed. I think Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Tettelbach's data showed that 7 applications within the standard deviation was about right. So I think the purpose of the research was to start the conversation about real world data versus vendor-sponsored data that essentially is HOPD, whereas our data was
A mix.
excluded HOPD. We had
Oh.
0 HOPD in our data. It was all nursing home, in the home, or at a private office, in
Oh,
a
wow.
private office clinic.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting. And I can't remember exactly the data, but Carter and Dr. Five, they published an article in 2019 looking at healing rates, and they were in the low 40, if I remember correct. And so when you talk about real world data, your study is showing that it's either there or above that.
Sure. And I think Medicare has different aims for it. But obviously, I think just your data or your research has a part 2. We'll probably have to do a part 2 of this as well. There's a lot more to talk about. So obviously, hopefully we'll have you back on. But you were talking about number 7, and I think that's my lucky number tonight. We're in Vegas. So I think we're going to hit the tables in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I want to thank Dr. Carpenter. Can you just tell us where people can find your article? Where is it published?
So it was published in Wounds, so you can find it in on the H&P network. You can find it PubMed. I mean, it's it was published in August, so it's pretty accessible. And part 2, we're just about to finish it up, but we're going to look at trauma wounds, surgical wounds, and the prelim on that is that you look at the data, and the other wound types heal at almost the identical rates as the
Interesting.
VLUs and the DFUs. And the reason is that if it's non-healing, right, you go through your lead-in period and it's stalled, well, the wound doesn't know what it's called. It doesn't know that it's a VLU or a DFU. All you know is that there are impediments, and some etiologies, they share the same impediments. Some, the decreased vascular flow on the microvascular level or on the macrovascular level. There's a common cause there. So that's why what we found over the last 6 years is that skin substitutes work across all wound types. And I'm excited to publish that part 2.
Great. Well, we'll
Right.
definitely have you back. We really appreciate you spending the time with us,
All right.
Dr. Carpenter.
Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, we're excited, and make sure you tell your friends, subscribe, like us. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram, and Facebook.
That's right. All right. Thank you.
All right, let's go gamble.
All right, 7.